So today I think we all know why we're here, because everyone read the title. We're going to talk about Introduction to Web Hacking 101. And when I say that, I want to be clear. We're going to be talking about ethical hacking. And by everyone being here, there is the assumption that no one here will take anything they learn and use it for malicious purposes. Everything you see here, everything you learn here, the concept is you will use it for the greater good. And we're going to talk about this concept of permission. When you talk about ethical hacking or hacking into anything, you have to have permission. That permission is what separates you from being a cyber criminal and being an ethical hacker or a cybersecurity professional. So before we get started, does anyone object to any of those terms? Good. Because I don't want to hear, oh, well, Brandon taught me all those things about hacking, and then I went to this website and discovered I could hack into it, so, you know, I put up a video of a cat. Let's not do that. So who am I? Who is this Brandon guy anyway? So you've all seen me, but who am I really? Well, right now, as Terry said, I'm a cybersecurity architect at Appalachian Technologies. I get to do a lot of fun stuff. I like to say I get to hack things and get paid for it, which is some of the best things you can, one of the best things you can possibly do. I have a master's degree in cybersecurity and information assurance from Western Governors University, which means they made me read a lot of books and write a lot of papers. It was awful, but I made it through. I'm an EC Council certified ethical hacker and certified hacking forensics investigator, and I like to program in Python and hack things. The agenda tonight, we're going to talk about what is an ethical hacker, what is a hacker in general. We talk about terms a lot, and for this it's very important when you start hacking into things that, again, we're doing it with permission, we're doing it ethically. So we're going to talk about what differentiates those two things. We're going to talk about Web Hacking 101. We're going to talk about the methodology, pre-engagement, intelligence gathering, threat modeling. We're going to talk about all these things and how they all tie together. And then we're going to talk about what's next. How can you train? How can you learn these things? How can it become part of your career if you're a developer? How can you test your apps that you develop? If you work in cybersecurity, what do you need to look out for, and what can you put into your environment to make sure your web applications are secure? What do you need to test for? We're going to talk about those things. So what is a hacker? Well, the modern version of the word hacker is a cyber criminal. If you look up the definition, that is what you'll find. But the original definition of the word hacker was someone who was very smart, very intelligent. They could reverse engineer things and make them better. That is the original definition of the word hacker, but it's kind of morphed over time. Now it's got a negative connotation. If you're a hacker, you're immediately considered a cyber criminal. So what is an ethical hacker? Well, it's that old meaning. It's someone who's doing things with permission, right? They might be reverse engineering things. They're doing it with the intention of helping. We're going to point out those vulnerabilities, those flaws in your web application before the bad guys do. We're going to tell you about it. Ethically, of course. So what's the mindset of a hacker? You want to move fast and break things. It's what hackers do. And in most cases, especially from cyber criminals, they don't care about what they break in the process. Your server might hang, issues might occur, DDoS attacks. All of a sudden your website's not working, your firewall. That's the way hackers think. Move on to the next target. What do hackers target? Well, everybody. There is no company that hackers don't target. No one is immune. It's not just the financial sector, it's every sector. If they're not using your information or selling your information, they might be using your hardware to mine cryptocurrency and data. There's new strains of malware that are just as sophisticated as the advanced software we have today. Malware that will determine, based off your system specifications, exactly what you're going to do with the system. If your system has a high-end graphics card, it might mine for something like cryptocurrency, where it's using your computer's resources to create digital currency. If your computer looks like it has sensitive information on it, it might install ransomware and charge you to get access to it. These things have become sophisticated. So what's the different kinds of cybersecurity professionals? Because there's more than one kind. This field's pretty broad. You have what you generally call the red team, and that's what we're going to be focusing on mainly tonight. Those are the people who are ethically hacking networks, the people that are going in and doing network and web penetration testing to see if they can break in. Then you have the blue team. You have defense. You have firewalls. You have antivirus. You have anti-malware. You have all these sophisticated kinds of technology and hardware to prevent hackers from breaking in. And then you have somewhere in the middle, or the purple team. It's a mix of red and blue teams, and a lot of people will fall into this camp. And I often say you have to be a red teamer to be a good blue teamer, because if you don't know how to hack into a system, how are you going to defend against it? We're going to talk about defense in depth just here for a little bit. When we talk about defending an organization, we want to build those layers of defense. The key thing we're going to focus on here is the data layer and the application layer, because as we'll see once we get into web applications, those are the two areas that automatically get exploited. Because oftentimes if you have a web application, you can get direct access to that data from the web application itself. You can often bypass layers of defense. But in a layered security approach, the concept is that you want to stack multiple layers of defense. Since nothing can ever be 100% secure, you make the probability of someone being able to break every layer of your defense so small that the actual probability of getting hacked doesn't really happen. Or at least that's the concept. But as we've seen in the news, it doesn't really work. So what's the hacking methodology? Well, the hacking methodology we're going to talk about is called the Penetration Testing Execution Standard. And it has a couple of phases to it. Before you even begin hacking anything, right, and when you're doing it in an ethical manner, the first thing you have is your pre-engagement. And this happens a lot for me and clients. Before we're even contracted to do a penetration test or any kind of web application hacking, we have to know what the scope is. What is the actual application we're hacking? And we need to make sure we have contracts in place that say, hey, if I break in to your website, you're not going to sue me and send me to jail, right? That's an important concept. I try to stay out of jail. It's not my favorite place. I've never been there, but I can imagine. I've seen a couple of TV shows. So pre-engagement, we want to set everything up before we go forward. And that's very important from a legal perspective to protect yourself. We'll talk about bug bounty programs later and how you can get involved in them. Intelligence gathering. We're going to want to gather all the intelligence we possibly can on our target. Threat modeling. We're going to need to know what threats we actually face. If you're a banking institution, it's pretty clear what the threat is. People could steal money. But if you're Hershey Foods, what's the threat there? Money, obviously. Chocolate, someone could steal. You know, a couple boxes of chocolate could fall off the truck. Maybe that's not a big deal for that company. But the one company I used to work for, D&H, their big threat was when large $15,000 TVs would fall off the truck or disappear. Depending on your organization, cyber criminals will target different things. So you have to model those threats appropriately. When we're talking about web applications, it extends over to the same thing. Then we're going to talk about vulnerability analysis. What are vulnerabilities? How do we figure out what is more critical to fix than everything else? Prioritizing, it's important. Then we'll talk about the actual exploitation, post-exploitation, and then finally, the reporting. So our pre-engagement, the three things we want to know: what is the reward for the engagement? Most of the time, people don't do this for free. There's some extent to it, and as we'll talk about later, a bug bounty hunter can make anywhere from a good one, from $10,000 to $500,000 doing this part-time. We'll talk a little bit about those figures, how accurate they are, and what kind of people are making that kind of money by helping organizations secure their computer systems and networks. We're going to talk about the rules of engagement. As I said, what's the scope? So first thing, intelligence gathering and reconnaissance. There's two methods to intelligence gathering. There's passive methods and active methods. As you can imagine, a passive method, you're not actually confronting the organization. Where an active method, you're going to create logs on the server or website. You have a much better chance of getting hacked. So let's talk about some passive methods. A Whois lookup. Who here has ever used Whois? So everybody's pretty much used Whois, but for the couple people that haven't, Whois is an online database that contains all the registration information for all the domain names. And when you sign up for GoDaddy and you find a domain name, it will ask you for an additional measly $15. Would you like us to keep your domain information private? And 99% of people say no, because they're not going to spend the extra money to keep that information private. So what you can do with Whois is you can actually look up a lot of the domain's information. And depending on if there's vulnerabilities in the way those domains were set up, you can actually take advantage of that information to find out every link on a website. You can find out all the subdomains. So it's a very powerful tool. And again, we didn't visit the actual website itself. So we're able to gather that information we didn't even go to. Look at job ads. Job ads contain a lot of information. Job ad up here, right? We know they're using IBM. We kind of know what systems they are. We know they're running Windows 7. They're not running the latest. And if we look at the other job ad, we can figure out what kind of technology stack they're running. Maybe we look at vulnerabilities and issues in that technology stack. Someone can find out a lot of information about a company just by looking at the job ads. This one's pretty classic, right? Dumpster diving, looking at things people throw away. It's amazing what people will throw away in the garbage. I remember working a long time ago for a manager who was very diligent. We shred all personal information. And I watched him take customer personal information and just throw it in the garbage. Not shredded, not torn, just there's sensitive information on there, and he threw it away. Happens all the time. Look at company contacts on Elliott Advocacy. Has anyone ever used the website Elliott Advocacy? All right, so what this company's purpose is for all the angry consumers out there who've ever wanted to contact the CEO of a company because you had a complaint. So what Elliott Advocacy does is they actually gather all that information. They find the CEO's phone number, their email address, additional customer care and personal contacts, all in one place. So the aspiring bad hacker can easily find this information. So you talk about phishing threats or threats that come through email, they're trying to trick people, you can go here and find out the CEO's email. Very easy, and you never touched, again, the customer's website or the company's website. So another one, this one's classic in the hacking arena, is Shodan. It's a database of all the information that you would get from actually visiting the website, so you can actually see a lot of technical information. This is the information for brandingkeith.com. I host my website with Liquid Web. They're a great website hosting company. I like them a lot. And you can see a lot of information about my website just from there. You can see I'm running Apache, so you immediately know I'm probably running a Linux server. You can discern a lot of information, not even touching the website. Wayback Machine. How many people have used this? Great tool, right? You can look at websites going all the way back. It archives the entire web. This is Yahoo, way back. It's unfortunately far too familiar for me. So there's some other types of reconnaissance tools. There's the Harvester. This is a command line tool that aggregates the gathering of information. So a lot of those tools we just looked at, subdomains, host, Whois, Shodan, integrates it all into one. So you can hand it some keywords, hand it some information, it's going to actually return you back all that information. So you can script that, you can programmatically gather information on your target. So you don't actually have to do a lot of work. Sounds great. Anything to save keystrokes. And there's another one, ReconNG. It's a full-featured web reconnaissance framework written in Python, which is a great language, by the way. Love that one. Doing recon, discovery, reporting, and it even has a little bit of exploitation. And then there's Maltego, or Malteo. I always butcher this one's name. Interactive data mining tool. It ships with Kali Linux as a community edition, but it will actually help map out the target's network. So this is kind of what the harvester looks like. As you can see, I gathered some information on brandonkeith.com. This is what Maltego will do for you. As you can see, that's a very pretty map. I'd venture to say that's prettier than some IT organizations I've gone into. And I asked them, what's your website look like? What's your architecture? This is nicer than what they have. And this is tools. Criminals use these tools. Don't mistake that criminals aren't using any of the tools I've shown here. They do. Cisco and a lot of the other vendors will tell you, yeah, we sell to criminals. We don't know that they're criminals, but we know they're using our tools. They use tools just like everybody else does. So we talked about passive reconnaissance. But passive will only get us so far. That's kind of like looking over someone's shoulder. But sometimes to really invoke a reaction and get information, we have to do some active reconnaissance. So active reconnaissance gets a bit more dangerous. You're actually visiting a target's website. You're going to create logs. And in general, if someone's paying attention, they'll know you were there. So there's a couple things we can do with active reconnaissance. We can actively visit the website. We can do what's called scanning and fingerprinting. Discover what the server is. Discover what services are running on the server. We can do what's called spidering a website, where we actually send probes through and we actually try a bunch of different combinations. Imagine if you could type in every single combination after a website to see if a page is there. Every combination of letters possible, right? I go to brandonkeith.com/images, brandonkeith.com/hidden information, brandonkeith.com/things Brandon doesn't want people to know about. If I could do every single combination, wouldn't that be great? I could figure out all kinds of things about their website. Well, you can. And you do, with spidering. So let's talk about actively visiting a website. So I'm an alumni of Central Penn College. And it's a great college. Let's look. I can look at some of the HTTP headers of this website. I can start learning. You can see it's running ASP.NET. This is a free add-on for Google Chrome. It's called HTTP headers. You can look at all of the header information. Now, people can turn off the header information, but they often don't. And now here I'm trying to see if it fails, pause that here. So what I did right there is I inserted a script tag into the URL. So what I was trying to do there was to see if the application would fail gracefully. You always want your applications in web development to fail gracefully. You don't want someone to somehow get it to throw an error screen that will give them additional information. That's what I was able to do here. You can tell by this error that this is running IIS and that it's a Microsoft-based application. So I now know they're running a Microsoft Windows server. I know exactly what version they're running. And I can begin looking up exploits or vulnerabilities for that version.
And that would be so easy to mitigate, because all that is a safe error page that says, oops, we can't find that.
Correct. So it would only take maybe 5 minutes for this not to happen. But oftentimes, in IT, as I'm sure those who have worked in IT and those who are getting into IT should be aware of, is things sometimes get hectic. Sometimes you don't always have time, and sometimes you cut corners, and sometimes you make mistakes. Because you might tell your boss, hey, we can get it done in 2 months, and they'll say, you have 2 days. Time doesn't magically appear. You know, I can't fit 2 months of work into 2 days, so something has to get cut, and oftentimes it's security. And these are the flaws you'll find when you're doing web application hacking. A lot of the flaws you'll find is configuration errors. The good part is, oftentimes you get paid to find those errors, so we'll talk about it. So we'll continue on. So that's this website. Let's go look at another one. Look at Harrisburg University. Figure out if we can see what's running. We can see that it's running PHP 5. It's not running the most up-to-date PHP. Let's see, what could it be running that's PHP? Maybe it's running WordPress. A lot of companies run WordPress. It runs on, oh, it is running WordPress. Look at that. So sometimes if you're setting up a web application, you're setting up the defaults. You're not automatically putting security. A better way to do this would be, and this would be something I would write up in a report if I was writing up a report to Harrisburg U, was you should be hiding, not hiding the fact that you're using WordPress, but hiding the admin page, where only specified people or specified addresses should actually be able to get to that admin page of the website. Not every user should be able to get there and then attempt to log in. That's not a good idea. The other thing about this page that is rather startling to me, as you'll see at the top, it actually doesn't use HTTPS. It uses HTTP, which means anyone who's logging into this website, their traffic could be intercepted and changed. And we'll look at that soon. And I bring these up as real world examples. And by the way, Harrisburg U knows about this. I've talked to them, they know about it, they're fixing it. Right? So they're aware of this flaw. But you see this across lots of organizations, multi-million-dollar organizations. And this isn't something, I didn't do anything really active when I did this. No one is checking to see who visits their admin page because I'm sure they have lots of bots and people visiting this page all the time. But the key is we need to recognize and help those in our organization recognize how important these little things are. Because if we cut corners or we allow coworkers to cut corners, then potentially the entire business could be brought down once those little mistakes add up. So let's talk about another form of active reconnaissance. Talk about Lancaster Online. Anyone familiar with Lancaster Online? Great publication. We're going to talk about the robots.txt. Who here knows what the robots.txt is for? A couple people. It is for Google. Robots.txt is to tell Google search bots where they're allowed to search. And it will actually tell them, disallow into this. And the idea is, you don't want Google to index your admin pages. That would be really bad if your admin console came up in a Google search result. However, the robots.txt doesn't actually provide any security. So you can go there and actually look at what the system administrators are telling you not to go to. And then you can go there. So in this case, there's something with admin, with TNS. So we go to that and we can actually see that they're actually running block CMS. That's how quickly we were able to discover what they were running. It's another form of active reconnaissance. So you might be thinking, well, Brandon, it seems like a lot of work. It'd be really nice if there was just an application that I could install, like a Chrome plugin that would just tell me everything a website's running so I can really figure out and dive in and hack. Well, there is. There's this great Chrome application called Webalizer, or Wapalizer for Web Analyzer, and it will actually tell you, we'll scan a website and tell you everything that it's running. So in this case, I scan mine. You can see everything I'm running. WordPress, you can see all the different JavaScript frameworks I'm using, everything on my website. So if you're doing web hacking, that's a great source of information. All of a sudden, I know a lot of the frameworks you're using. I can look at vulnerabilities in those frameworks to figure out how your website might be vulnerable. So let's talk about something a little bit more intense. So we talked about visiting the website, we talked about a couple of Chrome add-ons. Let's actually talk about some of the hacking tools that we have at our disposal. The first one we're going to talk about is Nikto. It's an open source tool. It's designed for scanning configurations. Remember we talked about misconfigurations is a big issue in cybersecurity? Nikto will scan your server and look for misconfigurations. It examines those HTTP headers we talked about, and it can actually identify what frameworks are being used on a website. Now, one thing I do caution with Nikto is it's very noisy. So you'll notice as we go up the scale and we use some more of these different tools, the noisier it will get. So good security administrators or good security engineers are going to catch this in the logs. They're going to see this happening. But when you're doing from an ethical standpoint, assuming you have permission, these are great tools to use, especially in your environment if you have your own web applications you're trying to test. There we go. So I ran Nikto-H, which is the host, and I'm actually running it on a WordPress server that I have set up. It's going to go through, and as you can see, it's starting to get back some information. I don't have anti-clickjacking on this application I'm using. I'm not using cross-site scripting, and I identified it as WordPress website. I found the login page, and then if there were more information, for this specific application, there wasn't a lot of configuration information, but would find any additional configuration information, it would then print out. So that's Nikto. Not super hard to use. I always say a lot of people are scared of the command line. Don't be scared of it, embrace it. There's a lot of powerful tools on the command line, and once you get used to using it and typing in the commands and the syntax, it really does get easier. I do keep by my desk, you can ask Terry, I have all these books and reference sheets sitting by my desk, and I do use them quite a bit to know what tool uses what syntax. They're very helpful in my day-to-day work. So the next tool we're going to talk about is called Skipfish. Now, I'm going to caution even more than Nikto. Skipfish is so powerful and so noisy and so loud, this can actually stop your website from running. So depending on who you're doing this for, if you were doing it, if you had a client, or you were doing it for a friend, or you were doing it on the public website of a company you work for, you have to be very careful with how you use Skipfish. And I often recommend using it on a test or development server to find vulnerabilities, rather than the production, because depending on the settings you use, it can actually bring down a website. So the advantages of Skipfish is that it's a very high-speed web vulnerability scanner, over 400 requests per second. And I think it's been, don't quote me on this, but I think it's actually gotten up over 3,000 depending on how you set the settings and how powerful your machine is, which that's a lot of requests per second. It's very straightforward and easy to use and detects a wide variety of issues from SQL to XML injections. So again, we're using Skipfish, and we're going to target WordPress. And you can see how fast the requests are going up. That second one, the HTTP request, it's hard to see, but it's over 7,000 already. So it's going very, very fast. In fact, once I think it gets to 20 or 30,000, I actually stop it, because it's making the website hang. It's not working very well anymore.
Quick question.
Sure.
Is it doing damaging SQL injection, or is it doing something else?
As far as I know, it's not damaging. So it's not, a lot of these scanners aren't actively exploiting a lot of the things they find. I'd have to check on that. The big thing with damaging...
It's important if you're going to test.
Yes.
You wouldn't actually just put a honeypot database in there that you can destroy.
Well, I never recommend testing in production to begin with.
You wouldn't want to test and do anything either.
Well, yeah, but you have to develop kind of a flow. So this is the report Skipfish actually prints out. So it actually prints out a very nice HTML report. It will tell you everything that's wrong with your environment. Again, it's open source, and it prints out a report that you'd almost get from an auditor. It's actually a very nice tool to have in your tool belt. So it's a great tool. I recommend using Skipfish. So the next tool we're going to talk about is Arachne. How many people have heard or used Arachne before? One. So Arachne is what you might call a web application exploitation framework. It's a pretty sophisticated tool. It's written in Ruby, which you'll find a lot of hacking tools are written in Python or Ruby. I like Python. Ruby's still a great language. But the key thing about Arachnate is you can really automate and schedule your scans. It has a very high success rate of detecting vulnerabilities in your website. That is very important depending on the environment you're in and what you're trying to do. It's 100% free and open source. The issue that a lot of people have with Arachnate and some of these other open source tools is the updates aren't quite as timely. It's not backed by a commercial entity, so you might not get updates quite as frequently as you might want. So this is Arachnate. It has a really pretty web interface, which might be a relief for some people with all the command line tools we were using. You simply type in your URL, your scan default, the description of your scan, and you can run a scan with various audits. And in this case, we're running a scan against DVWA, which is a very vulnerable web application. And you can see it already picked up a whole bunch of issues from the scan. Figured out some directories that were issues in the scan. It can find SQL injection. It can find all kinds of different vulnerabilities. So another great tool in your tool belt, along with Skipfish, to find vulnerabilities in your web application without having to do, a lot of hard work. Which I'm always, less work is always better. So next tool we're going to talk about is called OWASP. And it's an easy to use, somewhat easy to use integrated pen testing tool for finding vulnerabilities in web applications. Easy to use is different for every person. I have found certain parts of ZAP can be overly complicated, and the next tool we'll talk about, I've also found parts of it to be overly complicated. But it is still far less complicated than if you wrote all these tools yourself. So overall, it's a pretty good tool. It's also open source and free, and sponsored and funded by the OWASP organization. And for those who don't know what OWASP stands for, it's the Open Web Application Security Project, which is a nonprofit that all they do is advocate and create programs and development towards making web applications more secure. We'll talk about OWASP a lot because they are a major player in this industry and have been for a number of years. So ZAP provides automated tools and is what we call an intercepting proxy that can be used for finding vulnerabilities. We'll talk about intercepting proxies a lot over the next couple slides because intercepting proxies are the ones that can sit between you and the web server and the web application you're talking to. And you can actually modify the information you're sending and receiving back from the web application. If things aren't programmed properly, you can modify things. When I say modify, I mean get the application to do things it's not intended to do. Which really is the goal of most hackers, right? I'm going to get this application to spit out information it never was meant to tell me. So ZAP's a great tool. It will serve a lot of pen testing needs. However, Burp Suite is considered more of the de facto standard in the industry now, but it does cost $400 a license. So for the hobbyist user and the person just getting into it, OWASP ZAP is a great alternative. So this is the interface for OWASP ZAP. One of the things we have to be careful of whenever we're using an intercepting proxy is we actually have to set up the proxy in our web browser or web server. So one of the things we have to do is go and make sure we have the settings. In this case, we also want to include the scope. So whenever you're attacking a web application, a lot of times, let me step back. Realize what I said was confusing. So first thing you want to do is make sure the proxy settings are set up properly in the tool you're using. If you're using a tool such as Kali Linux, which we'll talk about soon and how you can download that, the proxy settings are set up by default. If you're downloading OWASP ZAP, which can be downloaded on Windows, you're going to need to set up those settings yourself. Whether you're using Chrome or Firefox, you're going to have to go into those settings and set up your browser to work through a proxy. I'm not going to go over that in detail because there's various tutorials that do it much better than I do, and OWASP has released a bunch of their own tutorials on how to go through and set up your proxy settings. For anything to work, that's the first thing you need to do. The second thing, when we're talking about our engagement, remember we did the pre-engagement where we decided all of our rules. Within ZAP, we can actually set up that scope, which is what we were just looking at. So this is the proxy screen, and I'm doing localhost 5000. But the screen before that, and I did this out of order in my video, we're actually setting up the scope of our engagement. So this is the website I'm testing. And the reason you want to set the scope of the website you're testing is because you need permission. So if a website were to reach out to another website that you didn't have the scope to test, and you were running a scan with OWASP or running something, all of a sudden you could be committing a crime if you didn't scope things properly. So in order to avoid that, what you'll have in a lot of programs when you're testing, you're given this set of IP addresses to test. And it's very important that you include the proper scope so that you don't go outside of the scope and then accidentally commit a crime or some unethical hacking, which can be very serious. One offense can lead to up to 5 years in prison and a very large fine. So fortunately, 95% of people never get prosecuted, which is a completely different issue, which we could have several discussions on. But just from an ethical standpoint, it's very important we include our scope. So here's our web application, DBWA again. And we can actually see with my proxy set up, as I visit the application, it's going to begin spidering the application passively. This is what we call passive spidering. So it's actually discovering all kinds of things on the application. If I want to do what's called an active scan, I can right click and spider, and it takes me through a wizard to actually spider the application. And when we say spidering, remember it's going through and trying all those different things. It's going to try all those URLs and see what it can discover. Spidering can be a very noisy process. It can create log files, so something to keep in mind. If you're doing passive spidering, it tends to look like you're just browsing a web application. It's very hard to tell you're really doing any kind of damage. Depending on, once we talk about bug bounty programs, some of them may actually prohibit active scans or active spidering in their program to avoid bandwidth issues. So that's something to keep in mind as we talk about web application hacking and making sure we're maintaining that ethical standard. So we found a bunch of different issues here that show up in the alerts. Skip ahead, Brent. Okay. So here's some of the issues it found, and it will pop up and alert on various issues, similar to other tools we've seen tonight. The other thing we can do is that, again, I mentioned this before, we can do what's called an intercepting proxy. And to do that, up in the, start finding that. Okay, there we go, caught it. So to do that, and this may be hard to see, and I understand that, we actually turn on the little green globe up at the top. And what that will do is actually create a breakpoint for our web application. And it's actually going to intercept the HTTP header traffic information. So for example, if we were at Harrisburg U's website and someone came in and typed in their username and password within this console right here, we would actually see their full username and password in clear text if we were intercepting that information. If it was encrypted with TLS or SSL, HTTPS, that would be hidden. It would look like gibberish. And that's why it's very important to have and use HTTPS on all your websites, because that information can be intercepted. For us, what we can also do here is we can play around with different form input options. So you might have some or a web application owner may have put some validation on the web application, on the JavaScript side, the client side of the application. But oftentimes we can avoid that by editing the requests as they come in through this web. Alright, I apologize, this is the part of the video I filmed this exceedingly late into the night hours, and I did remember I had a slight issue with this video, so we'll go over some of the interception in Burp Proxy, but this would be the screen where we would actually change the information of what's being sent across the proxy. So let's talk about Burp Suite. Burp Suite is a commercial tool that includes an automated crawl and scan. So like OWASP, it can actively spider and scan your website, but as a commercial tool, it actually includes payloads and can detect over 100 different types of vulnerabilities automatically. You can intercept traffic, you can automate custom scripts using Python, again, we'll hear that a lot, or Java plugins. It's very extensive. So it's licensed at $400 for a professional license, and over $25,000 for an enterprise license. So very, very much commercialized, but it's considered the de facto standard in web application hacking. So a little bit different than what we'd see on OWASP. There's a lot of different configuration pieces here. So we're going to be taking a look at OWASP. We're going to be taking a look at Bricks, which is an application that is vulnerable by default. It's built so you can learn web application hacking. So we're navigating to Bricks, and again, we're passively gathering all that information. Very similar to how we would gather information in OWASP. So what I just did there was the same thing, actively spidering. But here's what Zap's doing, is that, not Zap, Burp will actually ask me if I want to try specific usernames and passwords and various field forms. So it actually is fairly sophisticated in how I can try and brute force and attack different forms and break authentication. In this case, I ignored it all, so there's like 20 screens I had to ignore. And we can see all the information that it's finding. Now we're turning the intercept part of the proxy on. So we're going to see, again, this works the same way in Zap, what that looks like when Burp captures it. So you can actually see the login page. You can actually see the admin and admin username and password. So this is the information that we could modify. Now this might be just a login screen, but think if this were an online casino game, and I'm transferring money from my bank account into the game, or even transferring money overseas via wire transfer. This information is traveling over the internet. If things aren't secured properly, they could be intercepted or changed. Maybe there's an account number going through. Maybe I'm on a web application where I'm transferring money from my ID, but maybe I can change that ID number, transfer money from someone else's account. These are things we have to think about when we're trying to break an application. One of the best ways to hack web applications is to learn how they work. And then once you figure out how they work, how do we break them? Or how do we do what wasn't intended? What would the original developer never think someone would try to do? And when we do those things, oftentimes you find you can break it or find flaws in it. So we're not going to talk about this a lot, but we're going to touch on it because it's important, and I included some links for reference. So a lot of the tools we saw there, if you don't like any of them, that's okay, because you can write your own in Python. There's a lot of great tools. Scapy is a Python library that allows you to craft and forge your own packets. Similar to a tool called Nmap. If anyone's ever used Nmap? The open network, the de facto standard for scanning and network mapping. You can create your own pseudo scanner in Python. The other advantage here is you can automate a lot of these things. Another one you can use is the requests library. We saw a lot of that HTTP header information. Using the request library, we can actually automate different requests we want to send. So we can actually send a bunch of different requests, gather that information from a target, and we could do it again. We don't have to visit the website. We could actually just run a script and could go through various websites and try various things. And then Scrapy would allow us to run and automate and build our own web spiders, just like Python and just like Zap. So we can actually create our own spidering software to go through and map a web application. Another very popular and gaining in popularity tool is MITM Proxy. This is a command line proxy. It's very similar to OWASP, Zap, and Burp, but it's all command line. And it has a very heavy Python API or automation component. So again, you can automate a lot of the attacking you're doing. These are the things that the bad guys are doing. As cybersecurity professionals, aspiring cybersecurity professionals, developers, or even enthusiasts, these are things we need to be able to do as well. So, information gathering. It seems pretty simple on the onset, but that was a lot of information. The reason we spend so much time gathering information is because you really can't hack something if you don't know a lot about your target. You don't really want to try and break in somewhere without knowing things. You're just shooting randomly. There is actually a hacking tool. We're not going to talk about it tonight, but one of the features of the hacking tool, it will actually throw every single exploit in a database at a website to see if it can break in. There are tools like that, but again, they are very noisy and they tend to break the web application or website. So I don't recommend it. That's why we're not going to talk about it tonight. I don't want anyone to go home and actually break an application. Threat modeling. So we found all this information, we've done this scanning. What does any of it mean? Because we need to make it contextual. Especially if we're the person writing the report, we need an executive to understand and know why it's important, or we want someone to pay us for it. We have to figure out what the threats are. So we found all these issues. What do they mean? So what did I find? Let's figure out what we found. What's valuable with what I found? And what threat does it have to the business or organization? Oftentimes I'll meet other cybersecurity professionals and they're very good at what they do. But if you can't emphasize and talk about what the threat is to the organization, you'll immediately get ignored. Because you have to be able to properly model what the threats are to your organization. So what is a secure web application? Because that could mean a lot of things to a lot of different people. Is your web application secure just if it doesn't get hacked? Is it a set of guidelines that makes it secure? Well, thanks to our friends at OWASP, we have a little bit more of an answer. They've actually created a standard called the Web Application Security Verification Standard, or ASVSP, which is, it's a mouthful. But they actually created, it's a bunch of standards that if you follow and meet all these standards, then you can consider your web application, to an extent, from OWASP perspective, secure, and the fact that you've done your due diligence. The other thing that OWASP provides is a testing guide or a testing framework. So you're like, what do I test? I'm not quite sure what to test. It actually provides you a very detailed guide on here's how I test a web application. We want to analyze those vulnerabilities, because once we have them, that's not enough. Because now we need to know which ones are critical to our organization or whoever we're working for, which ones could bring the organization down in a single day. One of the things about the Equifax hack that was expressed to Congress was that the information security professionals didn't adequately explain the extent and the threat of the vulnerability that existed within their systems. They knew about the vulnerability for over 6 months before they were hacked. The security professionals knew about it. They had talked to management about it. But according to management, it wasn't expressed to them. And again, I don't necessarily believe this. But if this is the case, that it wasn't expressed to them properly, that's something, as cybersecurity professionals, we need to make sure we're doing better in doing our due diligence. So for that, we use the common vulnerability scoring system, which is what's the attack vector, what's the complexity of the attack, the privileges required, the user interaction, what's the scope of it, and what's the different impacts. These together will create what our score is. And oftentimes you'll see this if you ever hear someone say, oh, that's a class 10 vulnerability, or that's a 9, it's really high or critical. This is the scale that's often used to determine just how bad the vulnerability is. And that could be from a critical vulnerability that will leak, I don't know, the entire US population's credit report and information, to a vulnerability where, hey, they'll figure out we're running PHP. Your organization might not matter if they find out you're running PHP. Maybe that's not such a big issue, or not even considered a vulnerability, it's just information. But the issue with cyber criminals is the more information they get, the easier it is to hack into an application. So one of the things that OWASP talks about is the OWASP Top 10. It's another thing that they do. They actually rank the 10 most common and most prevalent vulnerabilities that are seen in web applications. With the first one being injection or SQL injection, broken authentication, sensitive data exposure, like the Equifax breach, which I think had to do with injection and then sensitive data exposure, so a little bit of both there. XML external entities, broken access control. I was working with an application that I figured out, if I change the user ID of this application, I can actually see other people's profile information by changing the ID and the URL. I wasn't supposed to do that. And even worse, I could actually edit those people's information when I wasn't supposed to. I brought that back to my developers. This was a very long time ago. And it was extremely difficult to explain to them why this was a problem. It shouldn't have been, but for them, they didn't understand the concept. Well, no one would actually change those IDs, Brandon. No one would actually do that. Who would do that? I was like, I don't know. This is tax form information. What do you think? If I could reduce my taxes, I would. You know, I'll make Billy Bob's taxes a little higher. He can afford it. So you got to be able to explain it clearly. Right? Broken access control, security misconfiguration. I'd argue this one's almost number 2. This is their list. But I see it all the time. We deploy really shiny applications, all kinds of security hardware and software. And then we run out of budget from spending all the money on that. We actually can't pay people to configure and deploy things properly. That's a big security misconfiguration, which is the same issue I'd say we'd have Harrisburg U, the Central Penn University, lots of companies, small companies all over the place, security misconfiguration at all levels. Cross-site scripting, Cross-site scripting we could talk about all night, but in a nutshell, it's JavaScript running on a web page that shouldn't be. It's allowing JavaScript to run. I remember several years ago, when I was in IT security, it was our policy to disable JavaScript on every web browser. Now most web applications cannot run without JavaScript. Cross-site scripting is very common, and I would argue that when we talk about bug bounty hunting and finding vulnerabilities, cross-site scripting will be the one you'll find more often than any other. Insecure deserialization, using known vulnerable components. I've seen this a lot, and I gave an example earlier today. Can anyone remember the example I gave? Windows XP. It's known to be vulnerable, but we're going to use it anyway. Did you know most ATM machines still use Windows XP?
Yep.
Banks actually pay Microsoft hundreds of dollars for custom updates and support per ATM machine to support Windows XP. But this happens in web applications too, because you use components that aren't always supported. And sometimes it might be supported, but you just don't update it, or the developers don't update it. And to be honest, they have a very good reason to, because if you update it, it might break the application. I remember having the conversation, Brandon, we can't update that framework because there's a chance it might break our application. And Brandon, we make $10 million every minute during this time of year. So we can't make that change that could potentially break that application. Now a lot of that goes back to proper testing procedures, proper Q&A procedures, but quality assurance and cybersecurity has to be part of that. Because the risk in many cases will outweigh the pains that we experience. I'm sure a bunch of people at Equifax, because they have 125, I think they have more now, they had 125 cybersecurity professionals working at Equifax. I've seen multi-billion-dollar organizations that are lucky to have a handful of people. Because cybersecurity professionals, they're very hard to find. And increasingly so, they're getting harder and harder to make because a lot of the universities aren't churning out. They're not just churning out qualified professionals with 10 years of experience. And in general, people don't tend to hire. So I know you have no experience, I need you to protect our entire network and infrastructure. Do you think you're up to that? I know you have no idea what you're doing, but I'm sure you'll do fine, or else. Unfortunately, that just doesn't happen. Ironically enough, one of the only companies I've seen hiring a lot of entry-level people is the government, so to speak. Which I think maybe explains a couple things. I'm kidding. But there's this, people talk about talent gap all the time, and I've seen the arguments back and forth, but I've seen it even in the consulting I do now when I'm trying to hire people. You can't find people with this expertise, and it's even harder. And this is why this is such a valuable skill set, everything you're learning now. It's even harder to hire application development security professionals. Because in general, application developers tend to hate cybersecurity professionals. Because cybersecurity professionals make application development harder. What do you mean, Brandon? What do you mean that's not secure? You know, I spent hours developing it and you're just coming here and tell me it's not good? It's not good, Brandon? It's like, well, it's, you know, I'm not. It's like, you can't tell me how to do my job, Brandon. You're not an application developer. Don't tell me how to do my job. Well, I'm trying to do my job. You know, I'm just saying, dump out social security numbers. I don't think it's a good idea. No one will ever do that. It already happened. Haven't you seen the news? We need to partner with developers. Those of us in security that don't know how to code, I think we all need to learn a little bit of programming. I tell everyone, learn Python at least. Even if you're a high executive level, just learn it a little bit, because then you'll have a better understanding of the process and how it works. Because it's such an important skill to have, and we need to have empathy and compassion for people around us. I think we use the word user quite a bit, and I think we use it too much. At the end of the day, we're all just people, not users. Insufficient logging and monitoring. So you notice I said you could find all this stuff if you were monitoring for it, or you were looking at the logs. Unfortunately, a lot of organizations don't have the manpower, the budget, or the money to spend time setting up logging or reviewing logging. This is an issue we have constantly. And they're trying to solve it in the industry with machine learning and all kinds of other sophisticated tools. But it's not really making as big of an impact as one would hope. So that's the OWASP Top 10. I included links there. When you download it, you can go. OWASP has a detailed brief on each of these vulnerabilities and how you'd exploit them. So let's talk about exploitation and post-exploitation. Many times, when you're hacking ethically, this will be the part you'll get to that you actually won't do. You will normally stop at this point. You discovered what you think to be a vulnerability, but here's the problem. If you actively exploit a vulnerability and test to see if it's a vulnerability, it's kind of like seeing that a house's door is open, so walking right in. You're trespassing. So you saw the vulnerability, right? The door is open, or maybe it's unlocked. And you're trying to say, hey, the door's, is anyone, can't find anyone. But as soon as you enter that door, you're now trespassing. In the eyes of the law, that's often how they look at web applications. As soon as you go and you can look at it, you can scan it, you can look at it, oh, it's a nice house. But the second you walk into it, you're trespassing. So when we talk about exploitation, we're actually saying, okay, now that we know what the vulnerability is, let's actually hack it. And that can be very dangerous, which is why I said with the contract and pre-engagement, you have to know the rules. In many cases, I think you were alluding to this earlier, Lance, depending on the exploitation you run, you can actually break the application, which if this is in production, is not a good idea. This actually happened to me at an organization. I coordinated with the development team, we ran a tool, this tool did some active exploitation. It would insert information into a form, right? And insert information into a form, like a contact us form on this website. Little did we know this was supposed to be the development server. This is what we were testing, the development server. It wasn't the main production server. But the development server had access to the email server. Well, things get worse. And within the development server, it actually had proper email addresses, just like in the production server. There were no controls to stop anyone from taking advantage of the Contact Us form and sending thousands of Contact Us requests per second. It only took a matter of 2 minutes from running this scan before all of a sudden I was getting phone calls. Hey Brandon, we just got like 80,000 emails from the Contact Us form saying test. What's going on here? And the Contact Us form in that organization sent out to not one person, but multiple people. So there were 10 people that just got 80,000 emails. Actually, we got to the point where we're starting to overload the email server. So we start to see how we have to be very careful. And that's, again, honest truth. It's a real world example. It happened. Shut down that scan. Will never happen again. We had a discussion with the development team. Going forward, development was never to have any production email addresses in. So there was a lot of conversation, but we wouldn't have discovered that vulnerability had we not been testing those things. And that's what was important. And thankfully I didn't lose my job over that. I was kind of scared. So when we exploit things, we're verifying if the vulnerabilities are accurate. So we may have detected a vulnerability, but we don't know if it's really a vulnerability until we test it. Perhaps we have mitigating controls. We might have a web application firewall that can actually intercept those HTTP requests and see if you're doing something that looks a little fishy. You might have something in your firewall that's blocking those threats from going out. You might have a bunch of different mitigating controls. There was a movement at one point to actually integrate active defenses within a web application itself. So there might be mitigating controls that actually, it looks like a vulnerability from the scanner, but when you actually go and test it, it doesn't actually work. That is why exploitation is important. It gets rid of what we call false positives. It's a false positive because we don't know. It marked it as a vulnerability, but it actually wasn't. A false negative is the opposite. It doesn't mark it as a vulnerability, but actually exists. The other thing we tend to do when we do exploitation is we can actually pivot to other machines. So one thing, and this is where things get a little scary, you might hack into a web application, and from that web application, all of a sudden, you can get an administrative level access on that server or box. You see this happen all the time. And from that box, you can potentially get to the database server. From that database server, maybe it has access to the financial records of the financial database. This is what hackers do. When we're testing applications, depending on your engagement, this is also something that tends to happen. You go from machine to machine. You do pivoting from one machine to another. From a web application test, all of a sudden we're in an internal test. Now again, that has to fall under your engagement to make sure you're safe from a legal perspective. Now during post-exploitation, and this is very important, if during that post-exploitation and part of the engagement process was a company might say, I want a full test as if it was a real hacker. I want to see exactly how far you can get, and I want to see exactly what information you can get. And that's happened before. As a consulting company, we see that and we get those requests. But we have to make sure there's rules in place. Because after we've exploited those things, we need to make sure we didn't break any systems. We need to make sure anything that was left over is cleaned up and no longer there. The worst thing you can ever have is someone who went in to actually do a penetration test and find your weaknesses, left a back door open that a hacker can later take advantage of. Now here's a story from one pen testing engagement. It wasn't with my company, but it was with a different company. A person went and they did a penetration test. They had all the details in this nice report about this organization. They wanted to change the format from a PDF to a Word document. They used an online tool to change from a PDF to a Word document. That report was stored in that website's database. That website got hacked, and that penetration testing report was lost with all the information from that report. Simple mistake, should have thought it through, but in the moment didn't. Those are the kind of mistakes that could cost an entire organization. A group of cyber criminals was handed an organization's report with all of their vulnerabilities. You have to treat these vulnerabilities, these reports, just as you would sensitive information, because that's what it contains, sensitive information. So let's look at some exploitation. I know some of the examples are hard to see, but in this case we're going to take advantage of a flaw in this search box here. We're only supposed to be able to search for one specific name, that is Smith, but we're actually going to use an exploit to a SQL injection in order to get all of the records from Smith. This is WebGoat, and we're going to talk about more about WebGoat. It's a great platform for learning about web application vulnerabilities. And there we go. So by using the exploitation, I actually got to dump out all the information in the database. with a bunch of sensitive information. And potentially you can actually pivot to other databases, other tables, depending on access and control. A security misconfiguration that's often in applications is an application will run as a database administrative user that can access multiple databases within an organization. So say an organization has 50 or 100 websites. Maybe only one website is vulnerable. By hacking that one website, all of a sudden you have access to all the information in hundreds of websites. Not a good thing. This one's pretty simple. It's a standard SQL injection. So here's a login request. We're going to completely bypass the login for this user. The user's name is supposed to be Alice. But we actually completely bypassed the password check. For those who missed it, what we did is we typed in the word Alice with the pound sign, which is actually going to comment out in PHP the rest of that line, because what it's searching for is actually going to ask, okay, what's your username and password? And the database is going to actually look and say, if the username and password equals the username and password in the database, I'm going to let you in. But by adding the pound sign, we comment out the rest of the line. So from the web application's perspective, it's asking, all right, so you're asking for the username Alice, nothing else. It just returns the result, which in this case logs us in as Alice. So that seems like a very simple, that seems very simple, Brandon. It's also very simple to fix. But this is still a very common issue, SQL injection attacks. We used to use these things called forums. Who here remembers forums, right? I used to be active on a lot of forums. There were these message boards we would go on and talk to each other before we had all the instant messaging. I remember being that person. You'd be refreshing the page, waiting for someone else to post, because that was how you communicated with people before we had instant messenger or Facebook or a lot of these other mechanisms we have now. A lot of forums back in the day got hacked using this kind of technique. They did a SQL injection they could bypass. In fact, I used to actually run a website. It was over 10 years ago. I had 33,000 users. I had a hacker hack into my website. They destroyed my entire website using something similar to this. Back then, I didn't know what I was looking for, and back then a lot of websites were even more vulnerable than they are now, arguably. And they were trying to ransom that back to me. I think we used AIM, or what was MSN before, Messenger. No judgment, that's what we had back then. We couldn't, Skype I don't even think existed at that point. And my website was ransomed back to me. They were making fun of me, asking me for ransom money. I was gone, my website was gone, they destroyed everything, no backups were there. Happened to me personally. These attacks can be devastating, and some of them seem rather simple, but sometimes the simplest methods are the way cyber criminals break in. So we talked about some exploitation. Let's talk about reporting now, because that is very important. We want to talk about how do we actually report vulnerabilities we find. If we're finding a lot of vulnerabilities, it might be a very formal report. If we're doing bug bounty hunting, we tend to report one vulnerability at a time in general. And we'll talk about why that is. But one vulnerability at a time, so it's very concise, but very inclusive of that single vulnerability. So what we want to do in all of our reports, we want them to be concise and clear. We don't want to leave any additional thought out. There's no think, right? This is why we think, we believe, or we know that this is vulnerable. We want to have an executive summary of all of our findings, because people aren't going to read a 300-page report, let's be honest. They'll probably never actually read through it. For a bug bounty, sometimes you'll include a short video of how you found the hack or the vulnerability. This allows the developers to actually know how you exploit it, because oftentimes when you're communicating, they'll say, how did you do that? And if you say it in text, it might not make sense. So sometimes a picture or video is worth thousands of words. You want to give an explanation of the impact of the vulnerability and the organization. If you find a vulnerability and you're talking to an organization about it, and you're not telling them what the impact is, they're not going to know why they care. Again, Equifax is a great example of this. So example reports, the report on the left. I know it's hard to see, so when everyone downloads it, you'll be able to see a lot better. That is a single bug bounty, a report that someone did. It was very short, maybe a paragraph of information that they included, and they got paid $3,000. They found this vulnerability and reported it through HackerOne. You can actually go on HackerOne's website and look at all their public vulnerabilities. But they can be shorter or longer depending on the vulnerability. Penetration tests cost an average of $33,000 or more per engagement, up to over hundreds of thousands of dollars. The man hours to go through web applications, networks, and find these vulnerabilities are not cheap, especially when cybersecurity professionals are at a premium and oftentimes overburdened and don't have enough sleep. People often ask if I want less cybersecurity professionals so there's less competition in the field. My response often is I like to sleep too sometimes. So I'd like there to be more people in the field. I'm not worried about over-competition or overcrowding. There's enough of a deficit that we need more people. Bug bounties focus on, again, one particular flaw or error, and payouts range from anything to $50 to $120,000 for one vulnerability. Now that can be even higher if you ever get into mobile hacking. The highest bounty currently available is for hacking an iPhone. And the current number is pegged at $1.5 million for one vulnerability. Now that being said, as far as I know, no one's actually claimed this bounty. But that is what's available if someone figures out a remote code execution, zero click for the iPhone. Zero click meaning the user doesn't have to click on anything. I can send a text message, I can compromise the phone or something of that nature, or just browsing to a website might compromise it. So those are what's available. Now what is bug bounty hunting? We're going to get into that in a couple of minutes. But first, let's talk about what's next. So we've gone over what web hacking is. We've talked about what a hacker is. So now you are a little bit more aware of the process. But what do you do now with this information? Well, the training begins. So what I used as part of the tests is, again, OWASP has this very nice image that you can download. It's called OWASP Broken Web Applications. And it's been a little bit since it's been updated. It's been a year or two. It's considered an inactive project. But the great thing about vulnerable applications is they only get more vulnerable as time goes by. They don't really need patch because the idea is they're vulnerable. And this is a list of vulnerable applications that you can actually test your vulnerability skills, so to speak, or your web hacking skills on. And it includes OWASP WebGoat, OWASPWebGoat.net for .NET developers. It includes Bricks, RailsGoat, which is part of Ruby on Rails, or the Ruby programming or web programming language. It includes Bricks, VWAP, which is one of my favorites, which includes over 100 different vulnerabilities you can test, all in one easy to download package. And then it includes realistic, intentional, vulnerable applications. Because what fun would it be if it was only applications that are training you? So it actually includes applications that are more realistic but vulnerable, so you can actually test. And then we'll take it a step further. It actually includes old applications that are vulnerable. So you can actually test how someone would hack into an unpatched version of WordPress or an unpatched version of Joomla. This is how you build your skills up for when you actually want to do web hacking out in the real world, or actually break into cybersecurity by doing this. So that's the next step. We want to do training. There's a couple different websites for learning more about hacking, ethical hacking, web hacking. One of them is Offensive Security, Metasploit Unleashed. Remember that tool I said I really wasn't going to talk about that can throw all those exploits at once? That is Metasploit. That will show you all, and it's a free course, and you'll learn all about how people exploit applications, build exploits, what that really means, how you exploit a vulnerability. It's a great course, it's free, 100% online. Nullbyte.wonderhowto.com has a bunch of blog articles on how to hack into systems. Very comprehensive. It has a web app hacking series. Very good to go through. Another one is cybrary.it for those who say, you know, I'm not really into the reading thing, Brandon. I kind of like to see things and practice things. I understand that. Cybrary.it is a great resource for going through free videos and learning about web hacking, learning about ethical hacking, and all kinds of different other red team exercises, as well as blue team exercises and IT certifications. So let's get back to bug bounty hunting, which really, to describe what bug bounty hunting is, I kind of had to go through this whole thing. But bug bounty hunting is application security testing in production. That's really what bug bounty hunting is. Companies pay for individual cybersecurity researchers to test their applications under certain rules and regulations. They actually post these rules through HackerOne or BugCrowd. They pay those companies to manage this, and they will actually go through and you will submit your reports to HackerOne or BugCrowd, and they facilitate the information and the money between the company and the cybersecurity researcher. This is how you can hack safely, improve the community by finding vulnerabilities, and get paid for it. Again, some people make good money by doing bug bounty hunting. In fact, one of the highest paying careers in India is being a bug bounty hunter. It's hard to believe, but it is. In fact, they actually made a chart of the amount of money that actually goes out to India just from bug bounty hunting. It's several $1 million every year. And a lot of that is because there's not enough cybersecurity professionals here. So the websites you can go to for that is HackerOne.com and BugCrowd.com. Another great one is HackerOne01.com. This is a free course that was developed by HackerOne that actually teaches you how to find these vulnerabilities. It goes through things like the OWASP top 10. It teaches you how to find them and report them. A great resource. The videos aren't very long. Very good presentation. So maybe we've started going through the training. Maybe we're not quite ready for the real world testing. We want to build up our skills a little bit more. So let's talk about something fun we could do that would build our skills, called Capture the Flag. So who's here familiar with, ever heard of the game Capture the Flag, right? One enemy captures a flag. In cybersecurity, Capture the Flag is sets of vulnerable web applications or vulnerable systems with what they call flags on them. These flags tend to be text files hidden in certain parts of the system. And you need to find these flags as part of the exercise. So you'll go through and find these flags and you'll report them, and whoever gets the most flags wins the game. It kind of gamifies learning hacking. Now, before you say, well, Brandon, what webs? It'd be really nice if there were a bunch of websites that let me do that and capture the flag for free. There are. These are all resources and websites that will allow you to play Capture the Flag, or sometimes they're called war games. We can hack different servers, web applications, and really define your hacking skills. Another benefit of this is sometimes by doing that, you can also up your job game. It can be impressive to an employer to actually go through and prove that skill set. So resources for getting started in cybersecurity. I always say it's important to do meetups like this one. It helps you network with other cybersecurity professionals. You learn about new things and you learn about new events. Again, I mentioned it, but cybrary.it is really good for any kind of IT that you're looking to get into. Another one I recommend is elearnsecurity.com. It has a lot of red teaming and ethical hacking courses. They are paid for courses, but they're worth getting into and you'll learn a lot. Another one I recommend to everyone is learning Python. And Microsoft, believe it or not, has a great video series about learning Python. And again, it's free. So what did we learn today? Well, we learned what a hacker is. We learned what the original meaning of the word hacker, what's the difference between a cyber criminal and someone who's ethical, and that is permission, having permission to hack into something. We saw some examples of various tools in Web Hacking 101, kind of learned the methodology for how we hack an application and what kind of tools exist out there. We also went over how you can get started in cybersecurity, do some bug bounty hunting, and really start to build that skill set. So one of the things I recommend after this course is, again, keep up with all current events on pahacker.com. You can always visit my very terrible blog at brandonkeith.com. It's terrible because I don't blog very much on it, but it does have some good resources that you can take advantage of. The other thing to do, you can actually sign up for Penetration Testing Student, which is part of eLearn Security. Again, it's a really good course. They don't give me any money to say this. You can sign up for free at theethicalhacker.net, which is a network of ethical hackers to share and collaborate with information, which is kind of what we're trying to do here. And you can find all kinds of information on there, go through. Part of that course, you'll actually learn C++, networking, and Python in that course. So, and again, you can get the bare bones version of the course for free. I think it's about $150, $200 to upgrade to the full course. Well worth it. And it ends with a certification that in order to pass the certification, you actually have to hack a system. So you're given a VPN access, you have to actually remote in to a set of systems, you have to hack a couple different systems, and then you actually have to fill out a report. And then based off your report, you get a certification. So I recommend it to anyone who's interested in advancing your cybersecurity skill set. All right, thank you guys. This time, does anyone have what questions do you guys have for me? We'll take a little bit of time for Q&A.
I have a question.
Sure.
As far as reporting after you go through all the steps to gather information and you have everything you need to put the report together, do you recommend any websites, any links that guide you to like have an idea of like what a report should look like?
There are a couple different websites. One of the things, again, that offensive security website, they actually have a sample report that you can look at that they recommend. You can look at some of the different ones online. The penetration testing execution framework that I talked about in the beginning, that all this is based on, actually has some guidelines. If you go out on their website, they talk about what should be included in a report. But no report is 100% the same, because every engagement is very different. So there's some things that you always have. You always have an executive summary, you always have your vulnerabilities, you always have your recommendations. But beyond that, depending on how it's structured, is really going to differ from organization to organization. There isn't one specific de facto standard. This is how you do a report, this is how it is every time. One thing that I say on HackerOne and BugCrowd, they have sample reports. They're not even sample, they're real reports that other people have submitted that have now been made public. So one way I recommend learning how to write a report is looking at those reports and how other people have written. Because if someone wrote a report and they got $120,000 for their vulnerability, that's a good person to emulate and figure out how they did it.